Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. We are excited to have each of you join us for today's program on putting patient safety first. Prior to introducing our speaker, I would like to orient you to the webinar system so that you can fully participate in today's program. If you wish to ask a question of the speaker, please send your message in through the chat box located on the right-hand side of your screen. The speaker will make an attempt to answer all questions if time permits. An evaluation will be sent to you electronically to rate today's program from the email clinicalaffairs@pentexmedical.com. We kindly ask that you complete the evaluation within 30 days. All attendees will receive a certificate of participation at the end of the program. In addition, slides are available for download in the Handouts tab on the right side of your screen in the webinar toolbar. It is my pleasure to introduce our speaker for today's program, Dr. Hudson Garrett. Dr. Garrett is currently employed as the Global Chief Clinical Officer for Pentex Medical and is responsible for the Global Clinical Affairs Program. He holds a Bachelor of Science degree in Biology, Chemistry, and Nursing, a dual Masters in Nursing and Public Health, a Postmaster Certificate as a Family Nurse Practitioner, a Postmaster Certificate in Infection Prevention and Infection Control, and a PhD in Healthcare Administration and Policy. He has completed the Johns Hopkins Fellows Program in Hospital Epidemiology and Infection Control and the CDC Fundamentals of Healthcare Epidemiology Program. He is board certified in Infection Prevention and Control, Family Practice, Critical Care, Vascular Access, Moderate Sedation, Legal Nurse Counseling, and Long-Term Care. He received the Presidential Citation from the Society of Critical Care Medicine in 2011 in recognition for his advancement of critical care nursing and infection prevention. He also serves as an industry liaison for the Association for the Healthcare Environment Board of Directors and is the lead faculty member for the Association for the Healthcare Environment's online certificate program in the Essentials of Infection Prevention and the new certificate of Mastery in Infection Prevention. He was also recognized in 2013 as the Who's Who in Infection Prevention and Control by Infection Control magazine. He is also a member of the Global Advisory Board in Infection Control Tips. It is now my pleasure to turn today's program over to our speaker, Dr. Garrett.
Thank you very much, Marissa, and good afternoon or good morning to you wherever you might be in the world. It is definitely our pleasure to host you this afternoon to talk about patient safety. I did want to disclose that there's not continuing education credit for this particular webinar. However, all of our future programs starting in October will be accredited for CNE accreditation. To learn more, you can visit Patient First, and the website is included here. As Marissa mentioned, on the right side of your screen, you'll note that there's a Handouts tab where you can actually download today's program handouts, and you'll notice that all of the hyperlinks are actually live links, meaning that you can click them and they'll take you directly to that particular resource. So let's get started with today's program. The objectives of the program for this afternoon are to discuss the intersection point of the Institute for Healthcare Improvement's Triple Aim concept, and more importantly, how does that apply to patient safety and infection prevention and control? We'll also finish today's program talking about some applications of patient safety and human factors with a medical device hygiene strategy, and it's really a reduction to healthcare-associated infections. And last but not least, we'll discuss the Patient First initiative and the Facility Patient Infection Prevention and Control program. So here's a quick overview for today's program. We're going to start off with an overview of patient safety. We'll then move into some discussions about human factors and how it could apply to infection prevention and control, and we'll finish up with some direct applications to medical device hygiene. So I wanted to start off with a little bit of a background of patient safety. And I want to go back to the core elements for healthcare reform and really quality improvement in general. Many of you are familiar with the Institute for Healthcare Improvement's Triple Aim concept that was actually developed by Dr. Don Berwick out of Massachusetts. And it's really about three basic tenets. The first is that patient experience quadrant. We want to make sure that we're improving patient satisfaction through outcome measures, quality, and safety. The second is that kind of abstract term that we throw around now globally in healthcare, population health management. which is really a risk reduction strategy where you look at a pooled aggregate model of health, and you're trying to take resources and make sure you're managing that health of the population as effectively as possible. You'll notice that one of the big components of that is the preventative health model, moving away from the traditional four walls of a hospital and going into home health, building that medical home model, and thinking about all of the different risk factors that are associated with things that could change, like socioeconomic impacts. And last but not least, something we always have to talk about, which is reducing the cost of care delivery. So we can improve productivity, we can make processes more sustainable, more effective from a cost standpoint, but also compare and benchmark against ourselves. For example, if you score a B on a test, well, why not try to strive to get an A the next time? So those little incremental improvements can make a tremendous difference over long periods of time. Now, patient safety itself is a pretty broad term. It could mean everything from relationships to successful to reducing healthcare-associated infections. It could be quality improvement, research. It really depends on which stakeholder you're talking to. But in the context of today's program, I want to talk about it in general. I want to really focus in on how can we as healthcare professionals, leaders, and patients, and I think it's important that we note that patients are always included, can improve the overall quality of health, but do it in a safer and more cost-effective manner. So a couple of pillars of patient safety that I think are worth noting. First, we need to establish that general culture of safety. And a lot of this relies upon executive C-suite championship. We need the leaders at the top, whether you're in the inpatient or the outpatient arena, to really establish that. And not only establish it, but hold it close. It has to be part of the essence of our being as healthcare leaders and executives. If we don't shepherd that, then the staff that are at the front line taking care of our patients will never feel fully supported. Accountability, I think, is an area where we have lots of opportunity for growth in healthcare in general. And accountability does not only come from the top, it can come from the side as well through peer-to-peer accountability. An example is I walk up and I see someone actually not sanitizing their hands before they start that peripheral IV. Or I notice a reprocessing technician is not wearing the appropriate personal protective equipment before they reprocess a scope. Well, if I fail to actually confront that situation, then I'm just as guilty as that individual. So we need to look at the systems of safety and make sure we hold ourselves accountable, but also hold our peers and our colleagues accountable, because that peer-to-peer accountability is tremendously powerful. Transparency is an area in healthcare where especially frontline clinicians get a little antsy about it, and for good reason. When we disclose medical errors or things that may have happened during the course of a patient's health care, it can be very difficult. It can be emotional in some circumstances. So I'm going to talk a little bit today in the later part of the program about disclosure models and how we can do that effectively and ensure that we're engaging the patient. Now, Team Steps is a program that was actually designed to improve teamwork and collaboration. It's held by the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality. It's a free program that you can actually visit on AHRQ's website, which is ahrq.gov, and you can actually download tips and resources to break down barriers in communication, especially across disciplines, because we know that when people work together in healthcare as a team and they're effective, that patient outcomes are far superior, that the actual quality measures come up, the patients are more satisfied, and we certainly improve mortality and morbidity risk. Now, this next concept is about high reliability organizations, and otherwise known as HROs. And this is kind of an emergent term where we're taking processes that existed in places like Toyota, where Lean and Six Sigma were actually incorporated years ago to make sure that we reduce errors. And we know that through recent reports that medical errors are a sustainable source for mortality and morbidity in healthcare. So building these more reliable organizations will help us in general. There are a couple touch points of patient safety that I think are important that we discuss. And everybody from the patient to the frontline healthcare provider to the medical devices that are used and the supply chain professionals that are responsible for purchasing these, all the way out through the payers that are responsible for paying for healthcare delivery, and also benchmarking and looking at the quality measures. One that's particularly challenging on here is public reporting. And there's public reporting in a variety of different mechanisms. one of the ones that comes to mind for my particular field is really looking at the National Healthcare Safety Network. The NHSN system is actually housed within the CDC and looks at a variety of healthcare-associated infections, but also other patient adverse events that are associated in delivery of healthcare services across the United States. It's one of the most robust systems that we have globally, because not only does it help us have individual facility level data, but it can also assist us in benchmarking against other hospitals or outpatient facilities of like sizes as well as service models. And I think that's really important for us to drive standardization and also learn from each other. Now, we talked just a moment ago about the Triple Aim, but how do we apply that to the Affordable Care Act and those accountability care organizations? A big part of that is delivering better care, better health for better value. And everything that we do in the essence of patient safety and improving quality and reliability is going to tie directly back into this. And at the end of the day, there's nothing more important than the patient. And I think we all need to be reminded that the patient is the boss. The patient is actually who pays our paychecks. And so as healthcare professionals, it's important to engage them properly in the process, put their thoughts and concerns front of mind, and make sure that we're also educating patients on these valuable topics about how to speak up, how to ask questions, and more importantly, how to tell us to stop if they're not comfortable with something. So now that we've talked a little bit about the core elements of patient safety, I'd like to move into some applied patient safety topics. So the first is this Swiss cheese model. Now, I don't know about you, but cheese is one of my favorite foods. And if I were to take a straw and just puncture some holes through that, and I get all of those holes to directly line up, that's actually where that adverse outcome or error actually takes place. But if you think about it, there's lots of barriers naturally in healthcare to preventing us from doing the wrong thing or from something bad happening to the patient. But when we have this unnatural alignment, that's actually where those bad things can result. An example of this is the chain of healthcare-associated infections. Well, guess what? If I simply wash my hands, or I wear my personal protective equipment, or I actually remove the microorganisms from the environment or from the device, then I can actually break that chain of transmission. So that's a simple example of how to break this Swiss cheese model for patient safety. And it's important to make sure that barriers are recognized as not just physical things, but also people. So that clinical intersection point, I think, can get very challenging in the regulated realm of healthcare. You know, we have everything from legislation to regulatory requirements to public reporting with continuous quality improvement. Of course, we have HCAP scores in the United States. We have other measures globally that are really measuring our customer satisfaction. And then you have accreditation agencies like the Joint Commission or DNV that are out there independently accrediting healthcare facilities and looking for core elements of quality, patient safety, as well as high reliability organizations. That can be difficult, to say the least. And we're really trying to get to those high performance organizations that are delivering clinical excellence in everything that they do. So what about future collaboration? Well, we notice that there's two that are really highlighted here in this graphic. The first is family, the second is partnership. And we have to engage not only the family but the patient directly. And I think when you look at some challenges in places like post-acute care, where you have maybe geriatric patients, the family can be a very instrumental part of achieving that high-quality outcome that you're really trying to get to. And building trust in building a relationship with patients and providers is important. As a healthcare professional team, we have to be able to trust each other. We need to make sure that we're properly empowered to make decisions and also address patient safety concerns at the site. And I think if you go back to the Toyota example I mentioned earlier, when you walk into a major plant like Toyota or other big manufacturers, anyone in that building has the power to literally stop the line because quality is so important that they want to make sure that everybody is empowered. And I think that goes back to respect and speaking up, and we can apply those same types of knowledge points to collaboration with patient safety in the healthcare setting. So what does patient safety exactly mean? You know, what is the actual impact? Well, of course, there's adverse events. There's mortality and morbidity. There's economic cost. And certainly the most important thing on this slide is the human costs that go with that. Anytime we have a patient injury or a death, it is substantial. It is something that not only affects us as a system, but it affects us as individual healthcare providers. And I think that no matter how long you work in healthcare, even if you know colleagues that are burnt out, it still affects us because we don't want to see humans harmed during the course of care delivery. And so the more that we can actually categorize adverse events and learn from those, the more impactful we would be in healthcare. And if we look at aviation as an example, it's a very safe industry considering how many times a plane takes off and lands every single day globally. And when there is an unfortunate accident or even a small concern, they take it very, very seriously. You know, we have organizations like the National Transportation Safety Board that really goes out and assesses every single aspect of that adverse event. They learn from it. They study it for years, sometimes at a time, and then they publish those findings available to everyone. It's not something that's competitive. And, you know, if you think about healthcare delivery today, it's a very competitive market. Everyone is trying to compete for those same patient populations in some instances. And so we do want to make sure that we share, we disclose, and then most importantly, we learn. So now let's talk a little bit about systems versus people. And, you know, healthcare is no different than many industries. We have that culture of blame that's essentially innate in our DNA to a degree. And so we point fingers and we blame. But is the blame usually associated with systems, or is it actually associated with individual clinicians? And the answer is very simple. It's almost always associated with systems, with a few exceptions. And the exception that comes to mind is that malicious healthcare provider. You know, I fully believe that 99.99% of healthcare providers get up in the morning and have the sole intent of helping people and helping their patients and going to work and doing something good to better someone's healthcare situation. But we do have people, as with any industry, that are simply not cut out for that or have malicious intent. And those are people that need to be weeded out of the system. And many of you may have heard of the technique or a concept called just culture that was developed out of Dallas by an attorney. And he did an amazing job at looking at systems approaches versus people. And those malicious behaviors are the ones that we want to expunge from the system. We want to get rid of them, get them out of there. But most of the things go back to systems behavior. If we have a bad system, we're going to always put the individual in the wrong position, and they're going to lose. But if we actually develop good, reliable systems and have associated training that is based on that systems approach of human factors, patient safety, high reliability, then we're going to put that person in a position to win. And it's always, always, always important to look at what can people teach us about systems. So I want to talk a little about the concept of human factors. And first we need to talk about some stakeholders. So if you think about this, human factors is kind of an exploration. It's almost like an advanced concept of ergonomics, which we're all familiar with. But all people that work in healthcare are stakeholders in the human factors analysis. It also includes people that receive healthcare. So that is the patients as well as their families, because they do have a stake in the process. You know, the infrastructure itself, the healthcare delivery processes are certainly a stakeholder, even though they're not an individual, but also our quality improvement methods. We need to ensure that what we're doing is aligned with the way that we're measuring it. And then when we have measures or outcomes, that we learn from those. You know, you can't possibly measure everything, and you certainly can't look at every set of data. So the more that we can get to those aggregated patient safety dashboards in healthcare, the more effective we'll be at managing expectations, but more importantly, identifying dangerous trends that might be taking place so that we can immediately act on those and really take that appropriate action, as I mentioned, to resolve those. So there's the concept of this systems-based approach to safety that really focuses on the recipients of care and then looks at the systems for therapeutic action and workers. And if we take the concept of medical devices like endoscopes, stethoscopes, blood pressure cuffs, things that are regulated and actually are designed with the intent to help people with specific functions within healthcare, we want to look at that method and understand how are these things designed, how are they utilized, how do workers perceive their use, can they follow the manufacturer's instructions for use, if there's an error or a defect, how do they resolve that, are workers receiving proper training? And I think training is probably one of the most important things that I can talk about in today's program, because it's usually one of the first things that we cut from the budget in healthcare. And training is not just a computer-based learning module. It's really much more explicit than that. We have to appeal to the sense of learning of adult learners. When we don't think about that, it's really going to be very non-effective training, and we spend a lot of money in training healthcare practitioners. But what we do want to do is make sure we're measuring accountability, measuring the impact to clinical practice, and then learning from that. One of the most exciting things that I see when I do training is that if a year later someone will contact me and say, well, Hudson, you know, what you talked about, I was able to not only implement that, but a year down the road, I'm still doing it and I've seen this outcome. That's so exciting to me because it talks about the impact of the proper training that, again, appeals to the kind of fundamentals of adult learning. The other piece we want to evaluate, too, is how can we use devices like hardware, computer software, or the medical devices themselves in our quality improvement. There's a lot of data captured on these devices, especially these intensive surgical devices that are used, scopes, telemetry equipment, that we can actually use to improve quality improvement measures. But sometimes we just don't think about that. And so involving our colleagues in healthcare quality, patient safety, infectious disease, in the healthcare administrative suite are very, very important things to think about. Now, let's talk about impact of patients plus the clinicians. And sometimes there's a natural intersection point, and in other times there's not so much. But those patients are really thinking about all the different circumstances that they have. What's my risk? What are my personal values and my preferences? Especially when it comes to things like religious risk or preferences, and immunizations is a perfect example of where there may be a disconnect between what we think medically and what a patient actually wants. And flu shots are a perfect example of this to me. We know that if you actually get a flu shot, that you reduce the risk for not only developing the flu, but transmitting the flu. Yet we have healthcare practitioners that may choose, for whatever reason, to not receive an annual flu vaccination. That does put patients as well as coworkers at risk for development of the flu. And so we need to think about that. What's that experience of their illness? Take a diabetic, for example. They have a long history typically of knowing their body, knowing what their particular challenges are, dealing with some social circumstances, but we need to make sure that as clinical providers that we incorporate that not only into our diagnosis, but more importantly into our treatment protocol so that we can get the highest possible outcome, reduce mortality and morbidity, and more importantly also reduce the cost that's associated with taking care of those patients. We spend so much in healthcare delivery, yet we have a lot of room to grow as it relates to quality outcomes. Now, healthcare risk management, patient safety, and quality traditionally are one of the fastest growing departments in an acute care hospital environment. We also know that hospital quality or healthcare quality in general is very applicable to outpatient settings equally. And so it's not just something that's limited to the constructs of the four walls of a hospital. But I did want to introduce this concept of clinical risk management. And I've noted a couple things here. So it specifically is concerned with improving the quality and safety of healthcare services by identifying the circumstances and opportunities that put our patients at risk. And I think it's important to note that quality and safety, circumstances and opportunities, and really identifying that overall risk. And anyone within the healthcare delivery network, from a receptionist to a physician, can identify any of these things. If we look at some of the unfortunate outbreaks that have taken place over the last couple of years where needles and syringes were reused in surgical environments, well, there's absolutely no excuse for that. But guess what? In some instances, the receptionist was the person that noticed these things happening and did not feel comfortable speaking up because they were not a clinical provider. But they finally did, and they saved thousands of patients' lives because they had the courage to speak up and say, something doesn't look right. There's a circumstance here that is bad, and there's an opportunity for infection, and I just don't think that's right. So again, that goes back to the elements of quality and safety. So how do we identify risk? Well, there's a lot of different ways to do that. One of the best ways that I particularly like is to round. I like to walk around and look at things. I want to understand what are the challenges that are faced by my healthcare team. How do I identify those things? Well, asking people questions, direct observation, looking at data, looking at electronic medical records to see if there's any particular trends. That next step that we want to look at is really looking at the frequency and severity of risk. Now, every single risk is big to me. I don't really like to classify things as significant versus low risk because at the end of the day, if I'm the patient, all of the risks are not good enough. I want to make sure I mitigate all of those preferably. And in some cases, you may not be able to eliminate the risk, but you can certainly place steps in motion to reduce the risk. And not only would that reduce the risk, but it'll also reduce the cost of the risk. Things like hand hygiene, really boggle my mind because we know since the 1800s when original studies were done that hand hygiene is the single most important way to reduce the risk for transmission of healthcare-associated infections. By the way, it's also the most cost-effective. It's very, very economical. It's less than a penny for application. But yet we struggle with about a 40% national compliance rate with hand hygiene in the United States according to CDC estimates, and the global rate is probably hovering around the same. So think about that. If you're the patient, a provider walks in, up to 60% of the time that provider has not sanitized their hands between patient interactions. Well, you know what? That's not something that any of us would feel comfortable with. And that's just one example of a systems-related process that is broken. And we've spent a ton of money globally in trying to address hand hygiene, yet we still haven't moved the ball significantly forward. Now, safety learning, I think, is equally as important. Looking at things like incident monitoring, and again, go back to the aviation industry where we have great examples of the black box, where they can really literally look at the start to finish, listen to the transcripts, listen to the tapes, and actually understand what took place. I wish we had that exact same level of sophistication in healthcare, but in some cases we have something similar. We have the electronic medical record, we have tele-ICUs that have come up where people are remotely monitoring. We certainly have sentinel events where we can learn from those examples that are published by accreditation agencies like the Joint Commission. And then I think complaints. You know, complaints are something that no one likes, but when you sit down and look at it, and especially if you get a meaningful, detailed complaint, not only can it teach you about the problem, but it also may help showcase the solution as we look to improve care. And complaints and concerns, I think, are something we need to do a better job of understanding, especially when patients or their family members actually have the courage to speak up to us. I know that as a healthcare provider, I get very concerned if a patient's family member says, you know, Mom doesn't look so good, Hudson. I'm concerned that something's wrong. To me, that's probably the scariest thing that I could be told, even more so than a monitor or a lab result, because when a patient's family, who knows them the best, says something's not right with my relative, I take that extremely seriously, and I will be at your bedside within 30 seconds. And some healthcare providers don't take that seriously, and that's a concept of safety learning that we could really improve. I want to take another example that's very, very prevalent across healthcare in general, which is antibiotic resistance. We know that we have overused antibiotics. We do a pretty bad job of using them in healthcare in general. We prescribe them for viral infections when we shouldn't. We have patients that don't know to take the entire dose for whatever reason. We have pharmacists that are not fully engaged in the process. And so we have a lot of different opportunities for improvement. And if you think about having a provider that's engaged, a patient that's educated, and a great pharmacist colleague that is there as your partner in crime, you can have a wonderful outcome that's going to reduce that risk for antibiotic resistance. Now, when people are resistant to antibiotics, of course, they can make them prone to certain infections. So that actually increases the rate for nosocomial or healthcare-associated infections. The length of stay, if the patient's hospitalized, goes up. There's certainly an associated increase in mortality and morbidity, and the cost that's really directly related to that. And then last but not least, from a systems approach, that we sometimes have to then escalate to different types of antibiotics that might have more significant side effects, where we could really try to get by with using, you know, drugs that are much more effective and targeted based on the antibiogram of the facility. So there are some examples that I think are pertinent in mentioning of patient safety programs globally that have worked very, very effectively. Probably one of the biggest ones that I really like to talk about is the Institute for Healthcare Improvement 5 Million Lives campaign. That was done several years ago, and it really was literally designed to improve 5 million people's lives and reduce events, improve infections, improve quality in general. And they did a fantastic job of resourcing this and creating good toolkits. If you're interested in those toolkits, they're still available free of charge on the website for IHI, which is ihi.org. You can register for free on that site and actually download many of those toolkits at no charge. But it was really a concept of looking globally at patient safety. Then if you've got certain organizations like CDC, where they looked at specific topics related to patient safety like antibiotic resistance. And they published not only tools and resources for the healthcare provider, but now you'll see more and more organizations actually targeting the patient themselves. And as a healthcare provider, we should all think about that. How do we make sure that our patients are as educated as possible so they can serve as an extension of the healthcare delivery team? They can be looking out for signs of infection. They can actually ask questions before their procedure. Before they get a medication, they should understand what that medication is for. Are there any associated risk? I hear all the time about patients about to receive that drug that they're allergic to, and it's in their chart, but we still are giving it to them. And so there's certainly breakdowns in the system that we need to address pretty much everywhere. And then last but not least is the World Health Organization's Clean Hands, Safer Hands campaign. What I love about this is they took a very pictorial approach to improving hand hygiene in healthcare settings. That website for that one is who.int, and you'll see it's listed at the end of today's program as a resource. But they really targeted not only the actual healthcare provider, but again, the patient. So you're starting to see a consistent theme in all of these programs that have had really, really good, robust, and sustainable success, where it's not just a healthcare provider initiative, but more importantly, it's a patient initiative. So I wanted to kind of finish up today's program talking about some of those applied risks. Now, infection transmission in today's world of healthcare-associated infections is a very hot topic. Just the routes of transmission. You know, we've had Ebola, we now have Zika virus, so there's lots of different challenges that take place. And what I try to instill in people is that I don't want you to prepare for specific pathogens or specific types of infections. What I want to ensure is that we have good critical thinking processes in place that when that next new novel pathogen comes out, we're not freaking out. We're very, very reliant upon our processes, and we feel very comfortable that they're high reliability. And I think that that's very, very important for us to think about. That person-to-person transmission from healthcare provider to patient or vice versa, or even from environmental surfaces to patients or healthcare providers is the #1 route. So the hands are certainly the top thing that we can do and improve that via hand hygiene, as I mentioned before. And again, that national average in the U.S. at least is only about 40% compliance. And so there's lots of room for growth there. The next you'll see listed there is that personal equipment, your non-critical and your semi-critical items in particular. And we've also had, you know, outbreaks with sterile items. And so it's important to note that sterile does not always mean sterile. Sterile could be, you know, something that's been contaminated through the manufacturing process, the distribution or shipping process, as well as the handling in the healthcare facility. So if you take a sterile catheter, for example, and you sit it down in the patient's bed, and maybe it's still in its sterile package, but it's open, it's no longer sterile. And so we need to think carefully through that, and also look at the technology that's used. You know, there's so many different electronic medical record systems that are out there. You have workstations on wheels, you have PDAs, so you've got BlackBerries and iPhones and Androids out there, as well as our own clothing. And I really love what the United Kingdom has done, where they've kind of eliminated that below-the-elbow approach to clothing, and they also don't allow ties. And these are very simple mechanisms to reduce the risk for infection. Now, 10 years ago, I could never talk to you about environmental contamination, where a surface itself or a medical device was really the primary source of infection transmission. And now we have multiple examples where that is the case. Even, you know, if you look at an average hospital room, the dirtiest thing in that room is typically the remote, the patient call light. The same is actually true for hotels. So when you go to a hotel next time, think about that and take a look at the remote in the room and see how actually well cleaned it is. So that environmental contamination, either through environmental surfaces like I mentioned or medical devices. And then of course you have airborne transmission for things like tuberculosis. And as healthcare practitioners, we're at increased risk for being a carrier for a specific organism. If you look at data that's come out of the United States, about 30% of most people in society are actually colonized with Staphylococcus aureus bacteria in their nose. Does not mean that they are actually exhibiting signs of infection, does not mean that they're going to transmit infection, but it does put them at increased risk. And so that's why the kind of controversial topic of nasal decolonization exists. And you'll see more and more data that's coming out that is supporting this when it's done correctly. So how does that actually directly impact patient safety? Well, we need to think about the patients themselves, and a big component that is variable is the cultural variation. And so it's important that as healthcare providers and patients, we understand each other. We understand those cultural differences, we understand each other's values, and that sometimes we may see things through different lenses. And again, I go back to that example of a flu shot, where you have multiple people that exist in every ecosystem within healthcare that just refuse to get vaccinations. And that is a very hot topic for most people. It's one that I get very heated about as well, because I think about the I guess pride that I take in being able to take care of a patient, and that each of us has. We want to make sure we're doing everything in our power to actually improve patient safety and not put them in increased risk, especially for patients because they're immunocompromised in many cases. But we do want to also think about the patient's specific background, and I think that's important. Now, what about the concept of assertive patients? Well, there's different theories on this, but if you think about it, most patients are not comfortable speaking up, especially those that are older. I think about my own grandmother. She would have never spoken up and asked a question of her physician because it simply wasn't encouraged. She almost saw it as a rude behavior, and so she would never question the doctor. But, you know, we need to think about not only the procedures, but specifically our medications and understand what they're being taken for, what's the duration, do we have an intended purpose, how long, you know, those types of questions so that we're very, very comfortable. And I think patients have a responsibility to be very transparent with their healthcare provider team so that we can fully understand what the risk-associated profile might be with giving that particular medication. And if you look at patient allergies to medications as an example, you know, so many people say they're allergic to penicillin, but recent data has come out that says most of those patients are actually not truly allergic. And so getting down to the root cause analysis of understanding why a patient thinks something, it's more that concept of the why behind the why. So disclosure, I had mentioned at the beginning of today's program, is a fairly new topic and kind of concept, but it's one that I think is extremely effective. So when you inform the patients and or their families that something bad has happened, but also more importantly, share with them what you've learned from that and how you intend to fix the system. I think that's very, very important. And again, this is a very uncomfortable thing and in many cases emotional. And it's not something that you would want to do alone, but rather something you do as part of a team that's very, very cross-functional and collaborative. So how do you do it? Well, the first is you need to be open. And you need to do it in a very timely manner. So, you know, disclosure shouldn't happen 3 weeks after the event. It needs to happen within hours. If you give someone an infection, you need to tell them. You need to help them understand how it happened, why it happened, what you're going to do to resolve that issue, and more importantly, how are you going to take care of them to ensure that. And you know, disclosure kind of opens those doors and thoughts about lawsuits, but what we find is that the data shows that lawsuits actually go down when you disclose. Confidentiality is important to make sure you're maintaining that with your patient and really just acknowledging the fact that things didn't go so well. But it's not just a patient-focused initiative. We also need to support our frontline colleagues and staff members. So the support for the staff is very, very important. And an apology is not an admission of guilt. An apology is simply being empathetic. It's really telling people that we hear what you're saying, we're very upset that this has happened to you, and we acknowledge that that's really hard. So it doesn't have to be tied with an admission of liability. But you do want to make sure that you have reasonable expectations of what's taking place. So, for example, if we identify that someone was given the wrong blood, you know, that's not something we can just fix overnight necessarily. We need to really evaluate the system, make sure we have all the right resources and stakeholders at the table, but it is something we would take extremely seriously. Other things you may be able to fix fairly instantly, you know, through the use of the electronic medical record or staff training, but training is always a very dangerous way just to address things, so we have to make sure we're doing it in a multifactorial approach. I did want to share this concept of spikes. I like it because it sticks out in my head, but it's really a way for us to pay attention to our patients and deliver and disclose in a very effective way that helps us feel in control of the situation and gives us a way to essentially kind of end it at the end as well. So the first step is really sharpening your listening skills. You want to make sure that you hear what the patient says and understand and speak in their language. And I think that's a hard thing for us to do because we're tempted to talk in medical jargon, but that's not effective for patients nor their families. We do want to also pay attention to those patients' perceptions, and these are going to be different from patient to patient. And so the more that we can understand about what they're thinking, why they're experiencing that, I don't want to say that it's necessarily counseling, but it's a degree of that. We want to ensure that we're actually listening to the patient and what their concerns are as well. Now, if the patient has questions, we want to make sure they feel this is a safe environment and that they fully know the facts. I think that's probably one of the hardest things is you really want to disclose the good, bad, and the ugly. It's not something where you just get to pick, you know, this is the one part, we're not going to tell you about the rest. Full disclosure is exactly as it sounds, full disclosure. And I think it's okay, too, to explore your own emotions. You know, there's something wrong when you are able to disclose something that happened badly and it doesn't affect you. You know, we don't want to become hardened to that, but we also want to make sure we're still professional and also share with the family and the patient the next steps. So with any complex system comes that increased chance of something going wrong, and I really remind myself of this daily because it really grounds you in the reality that we face. We're not perfect, we're human, something will go wrong, and the more that you do, the higher the risk is. And as our healthcare systems, devices, and products become more complex in healthcare, there's always going to be that increased risk. And so training, education, management of those devices, validation, and ongoing education is going to be equally as important. So I want to finish up with some applications of human factors, and then we'll talk about medical device hygiene before we take question and answers. But human factors is really that study of all the factors that make it easier to do the work in the right way. And it's, like I said at the beginning of today's program, it's an advanced concept of ergonomics, but it really applies everywhere where humans work. So it's not just an inpatient or an outpatient thing. It's not just an OR versus an endoscopy room thing or an outpatient clinic. It's really every single place. This has been used successfully in other industries like the airline industry and manufacturing. So, going back to Toyota, they're notorious for publishing work on this where they looked at human factors analysis. Things like occupational workloads, providing people better workstations so that they're actually not getting strain on their eyes is an example of where human factors analysis has been used in the past very successfully. So there are different components to it. There's the psychomotor, there's the senses, the output, the input devices themselves. And so we need to think about, as it relates to a medical device, that we have to touch things. And so when we touch things, there's that risk. There's all different buttons and ways to simulate different types of protocols within devices. And so we need to be familiar with the manufacturer's instructions for use. But more importantly, how do we find help if we need it? And how does that affect the senses? If I think about days where I look at a computer monitor for, hours on end and how much it makes my head hurt, well, that's a concept of fatigue, and that actually wears on us as healthcare providers. So we need to think about what that is. Alarms in healthcare are another area that have been heavily studied, where we just silence them and silence them again and silence them again. Well, there's a reason there's an alarm, and I understand they're very annoying, but they're annoying for a reason so that we don't ignore them. So monitoring alarms and looking at display panels is important. We don't want to rely on computers or devices to do our jobs, but we want to make sure we use them very effectively so that we can better do our jobs. And is it okay to fail? Is a tough conversation, but it absolutely is. It really goes back to that concept that we're not human. I mean, we're not perfect, we're simply human. So that ability to fail is just innately there. It also helps us realize that errors will happen despite every single thing that we do. Even if you have the most wonderful hospital in the world, you will still have errors because humans are involved. And so regardless of how well we design our systems, that will help us reduce errors. But when humans are there, you will always have that potential opportunity for that, and errors are bound to happen. So one definition of human error is simply human nature, and I like that because, again, it gives us a little bit of credence to talking about the fact that we're completely fallible. It's something that is going to happen, and we need to be ready to acknowledge that. But error is the inevitable downside. And so what we do with errors is a way for us to improve the quality of care that we deliver, improve patient safety, and engage the patient in the process. So I want to finish up with the concept of device hygiene and infection control. We've talked a lot today about patient safety. We've talked about human factors. We've talked about some lean processes. And how do we apply that to concepts associated with medical devices that are very, very complex, widely used in healthcare, and quite frankly can have associated risk when not used correctly? Well, there's all different types of concepts associated out there. And many of these result from recent outbreaks with healthcare-associated infections or other issues. And so it's not just a healthcare-associated infection issue, but it's really a very large exponential thing that we can talk about. But there's everything from the disposable concept where you actually take high-risk parts and you create disposable mechanisms that can just be tossed versus reprocessed. I think about blood pressure cuffs as an example. Especially in intensive care settings, you'll see many, many hospitals go to disposable blood pressure cuffs where they'll use it for the single patient for the duration of their stay. Well, I'll walk into hospital rooms and I'll find the blood pressure cuff actually wrapped around the bed rail. Well, as somebody who spends a lot of time in infection prevention, I know that's one of the most heavily colonized areas in the medical environment. So placing the blood pressure cuff there is probably not the best thing to do from a human factor standpoint. But we need to think through those things critically. And in healthcare in general, we've become so reliant upon technology and algorithms and systems that sometimes we don't fully critically think through issues. That next concept is reasonable instructions for use. We want to make sure that regardless if it's a pulse oximeter or a blood pressure cuff, a surgical instrument or an endoscope, that you can actually use it effectively and safely and follow the instructions for use, both for the use of the device as well as the reprocessing. High-level disinfection is something that is used primarily for semi-critical items. As a reminder, semi-critical items are those that come in contact with mucous membranes of the patient, but not sterile body cavities. Examples are endoscopes, laryngoscope blades, things of that nature. And then you have the critical items like surgical instruments that require sterilization because they are going in sterile body cavities. And at the very low end of that totem pole is your non-critical items, which ironically is the bulk of what we use in healthcare. And those are things that come in contact with intact patient skin, so like blood pressure cuffs, stethoscopes, those types of things. Each one of those has a different type of disinfection required. So if it's critical, it's sterilization. If it's semi-critical, it's high-level disinfection. And if it's non-critical, it's low-level disinfection. But understanding the differences between those is very, very important. And then ATP validation is something that is hot as a topic right now in the environmental hygiene world, as well as looking at compliance with things like hand hygiene. But ATP, again, is that adenosine triphosphate, that living molecule of life that we can actually measure now with a simple swab of the hand or a surface or a device and get that digital readout. The closer we get to zero, the better off we are. Now, if we take a device or a surface from 30,000 ATP units down to 30, well, that's a substantial reduction. And the associated risk of transmission of infection or other things like biofilms is reduced exponentially. And so it's really a very valuable tool. It's very economical. ATP meters range about $1,000, and then the test is about $1 a test. So it's very, very easy and cost-effective to do this as a validation of your system. Now, it does not tell you what specific organisms are present, but it does tell you a validation of the efficacy and efficiency of your cleaning and disinfection process. And then last but not least is looking at these human factors validated instructions for use, as well as turning those into interactive in-service support materials so that we can make sure that we're actually delivering the right type of education for the right stakeholder. You know, physicians have a very different way of learning than nurses do and vice versa, but they all do a very similar role in protecting and helping the patient. But we need to appeal to the individuality of each one of the professions and disciplines and then make sure that we're communicating across those disciplines. So how can we really improve patient safety? Well, part of it, again, is establishing the culture of safety, and that is held by the C-suite executive chain. We got to make sure our leaders are engaged, sitting at the table, and get patients involved. If you've got great patients that you work with, get them involved in your process. Make sure that you have the right policies and the procedures and those high reliability organization components. And don't ever forget training. Training is something that should happen when you're hired, and it should be continuous. We should never stop learning in healthcare. When I hear colleagues say, well, oh, I already got my degree, I'm done, it just infuriates me because you cannot be relevant and providing safe patient care if you don't keep up with the evolving trends and technologies that exist out there. And that's really where that organizational learning and safety management comes in. So I did want to share with you the references for today's program. All of these are available free of charge. You can simply click the web links there. And again, if you have not downloaded the handouts from today's program, you can certainly do that on the right side of the screen. If you do experience difficulty, not to worry. We're going to actually send a copy of the slides along with the program evaluation at the completion of today's program. So we'll talk a little bit about that in just a second. So with that, I'll see if we have any questions. If you do have a question, as a reminder, you can actually send that in through the chat box located on the right side of your screen, and I'll make an attempt to answer any and all questions that we have. You're also welcome to email me at any point if you have a more individual question that you'd like to run past me. I'll be happy to help you with that offline, and my email address is contained there as well. So it does appear that we've got a few questions, so I'll go through those, and then we'll turn it back over to the moderator for some closing comments. But the first question is there an established curriculum for patient safety that I can actually build into my endoscopy suite? Is a great question. So it depends on what you want to accomplish from that. If you're looking to look at general patient safety, building processes in place, I would highly recommend the World Health Organization program, and that is contained in the references link on the slide before this. It provides different types of slides. There's a multifactorial patient safety guide that you can download at no charge, but it's got some great posters associated with that, and it's not discipline specific. So I think that that would be a great starting point. You also bring up an excellent concept of we need to start educating students. It's not good enough when we get you as an established healthcare provider and start talking to you about patient safety. We need to do it up front in the curriculums that are coming out for professional schools, medical, nursing, pharmacy, it doesn't matter. We need to make sure we're capturing them while they're actually in the clinical learning environment versus when they become a practitioner and are actually out there. So hopefully that helps answer your question. The next question is what do you see as the most significant risk for healthcare-associated infections? Probably complacency, and simply what I mean by that is that we have gotten comfortable in some circumstances with doing certain things. My favorite response from adults is, I've always done it that way. I've always done it way that, to me is just a screaming alarm that says this person might be dangerous. And I hate to say that, but simply because something has always been done that way does not mean that it's safe, effective, or the right thing to do. And as evidence continues to change, we need to ensure that we keep up with that. So we need to really make sure that we're looking at the latest evidence-based practices, clinical guidelines, recommendations from our societies, and then incorporating those into our daily practice. And keep in mind that the data shows it takes about 17 years to implement fully one evidence-based practice in the healthcare setting. Well, 17 years is a long time. Many of us will probably not still be doing the same thing that we're doing today. And so it's important to note that we need to kind of shorten that time frame as much as possible so that when we find out what are the right things to do, we can actually give that benefit to every single patient we touch. So hopefully that answers that question. The next question is why do we have so many medical errors? Well, if I knew the answer to that fully, I would, probably be a very rich man. But medical errors are a result of many different things, but as I go back to what we talked about earlier, most always it's a systems-related process. And so we need to evaluate our systems and ensure that we are setting people up for success. When we look at a policy, for example, to start a peripheral IV, and it's 23 pages with another 5 pages of references, how effective will we be at actually ensuring accountability with that policy? Well, there's no way that we can do that. And so we need to make things practical, accessible, and actually impactful. And so those are the 3 kind of characteristics I look for in my mental checklist to make sure that what I'm doing is going to actually benefit patient safety and not cause harm or burden upon the staff when they already have enough burden on them. So hopefully that helps. Looks like the next question that we have is there a good resource to actually help us identify ways to improve patient safety? There are many different ones. I think that one of the things that we need to think about is how do we improve patient safety as a whole, rather than focus on individual concepts. So I don't just talk about infections, or I don't just talk about falls, or wrong blood type, blood being administered, or medication errors. I really look at patient safety and systems in general. I feel like if we really fix the systems, then we can actually indirectly almost immediately impact some of the individual problems. So I think that that's the way that we want to think about that. And again, we need to do a better job of engaging patients. Patients are like, encyclopedias of a knowledge that if we tap into their brains and pull out the meaningful nuggets of knowledge, then we can actually incorporate those into our patient safety program. The next question is, do you see any negative effects of the FDA's recent banning of 19 ingredients found in hand sanitizers? So if you're not familiar with that, the FDA just recently in the last week released a ban for consumer hand soaps. And I think it's important to note, since we have healthcare providers on today's call, that we are not talking about hand hygiene agents that are used in healthcare settings. So I just want to repeat that they are not talking about hand hygiene agents used in healthcare settings. This is something limited to consumers at this time. The FDA's rationale was that there are certain ingredients like triclosan that are used in these chemicals, or used as chemicals in these agents, that have not demonstrated substantial efficacy over traditional soap and water. And there's also concern from a patient safety standpoint about them being endocrine disruptors. And so we need to think carefully about, is there a risk-benefit analysis done on each of these products? And this goes with anything from medical devices to hand soaps. And so they did actually issue a ban after substantial data was not produced to the FDA to evaluate. And so I think you'll see more and more of this, especially as the consumer market becomes increasingly educated about what we're putting on our bodies, in our bodies, and injecting in our bodies. And so, medication example is a perfect thing of that, but it has not affected anything in healthcare. The other thing, just from a general infection control standpoint, is that I'm not, hugely worried about the bugs that you have in your home, unless you're a cancer patient or HIV or something like that, where you have an immunocompromised situation that's a little bit different. But certainly in healthcare settings, I am worried about that. And so antibacterial soap and water or alcohol-based hand gels or wipes or foams are going to continue to be used, at least in the near future. So I don't see any change on the horizon with that. That looks like that is all the questions that have come in at this point. If you do have additional questions, feel free to email me. Again, my email is hudson.garrett@pentexmedical.com. At this point, I'll turn it back over to our moderator, Marissa, to make some closing comments. Marissa?
Dr. Garrett, thank you so much for a wonderful program. I also want to thank all of the attendees who participated today. The webinar evaluation will be automatically sent to you via email within 24 hours of today's program. Please check your spam box, as the email will come from clinicalaffairs@pentexmedical.com. A certificate of participation will be included with the evaluation. In addition, the slides from today's program will also be included. So this concludes today's continuing education program, and we look forward to your participation in upcoming webinars remaining in this series. Please remember to sign up for Patient First on patientfirst.pentexmedical.com. A link to register will also be included in the follow-up email.
Thank you very much for joining today's program. We hope you've enjoyed it, and for additional information, you can visit the patient safety website there on patientfirst.pentexmedical.com. Thank you very much, and have a great day.